There is a heavy, honest silence that settles over the blue mountains at dusk, a silence that doesn't ask anything of you. I've spent 65 years chasing that feeling. If you were to pull up to my place on a Tuesday, past the overgrown eucalypts and the sagging fence line, you wouldn't see a titan of industry. You'd see a man in stained work boots and a threadbare flannel shirt, knee-deep in soil, arguing with a patch of heirloom tomatoes. My name is Arthur Sterling, though the locals just call me Artie. To the pub crowd, I'm the bloke with dirt under his fingernails and a dry sense of humor. They don't know that my company, Sterling Logistics, quietly moves the freight that keeps this nation's heart beating. I prefer it that way. My pride isn't a luxury import. It's a 2005 Toyota Land Cruiser. Its bull bar is scarred by years of bush tracks, and its paint is a dull, dusty gray that blends into the scrub. People look at that truck and see a pensioner to be pitied or ignored. That's the beauty of it. When you look like you have nothing to lose, you gain the rare privilege of seeing people for who they truly are, stripped of the filters of greed or deference. I've built my life on the belief that a man's worth isn't found in his job title or the polish on his shoes, but in the calluses on his palms and the steadiness of his word. It's a lesson I learned the hard way, forged in the heat of a betrayal that nearly stripped me bare 30 years ago. Life has a habit of testing those lessons. My daughter, Sophie, is the light of my world. She possesses her mother's fierce intellect and a heart far too large for this cynical age. When she first brought Julian Banks home, I was in the kitchen, wiping the mud from my boots, feeling the ache of age in my lower back. Julian entered like he was conducting an orchestra. He was sharp, tailored in a suit that likely cost more than my first haulage truck, and he carried a self-assurance that felt less like confidence and more like a challenge. He shook my hand with that practiced, firm grip taught in elite business schools, but his eyes never truly settled on me. They swept over my kettle, my worn-out floorboards, and the simplicity of my home, before flicking back to Sophie with a look of possessive pride. I didn't say much that evening. I poured the tea, listened to his polished jargon about market landscapes and leverage, and watched how he filled a room that had never known such pretense. A strange, cold clarity washed over me, the same intuition that signals a storm rolling over the ranges. I didn't see a partner for my daughter. I saw a man who had been told yes his entire life, a man who had never had to claw his way out of the dirt to survive. I looked at photos of Sophie on the mantel, thinking of the foundation I'd built for her, brick by painful brick. I knew then that I had to be careful. Not because I'm a cold man, but because I'm a father, and in this country, we protect our own. I didn't yet know that a ghost I'd buried decades ago was about to walk into my life again, draped in the clothes of my son-in-law. I just knew that life as I knew it was about to change. I've never been a man who acts on impulse. A lifetime in logistics teaches you that the quickest way to ruin is a decision made in haste. After meeting Julian, I didn't lash out or forbid Sophie from seeing him. Instead, I did what I've always done when faced with an unknown variable. I conducted an audit. Over the next few weeks, I quietly activated my internal vetting team, a group of trusted professionals who have been with me since the days we were operating out of a single shipping container in Botany Bay. They work in the shadows, and they don't miss a beat. The dossier they compiled on Julian Banks was, on the surface, impressive. He was a high flyer in the Sydney financial district, sharp, efficient, and possessed an uncanny ability to turn struggling divisions into profit machines. His numbers were flawless. He was the kind of talent any board of directors would kill for. Yet, something in the cold efficiency of his track record didn't sit right with me. It was too clean, too rehearsed. It was the record of a man who treated people like data points on a spreadsheet rather than human beings. Still, Sophie was head over heels. She loved his ambition, his city, polish, and the way he talked about the future. I didn't want to be the grumpy old man in the mountains who drove his daughter away, so I decided to play the long game. I did something I had never done in 20 years of business. I reached out to a contact in the executive search firm that was currently scouting for a new CEO for Sterling Logistics. I dropped a name, greased the wheels, and watched. Within weeks, Julian was headhunted. The interview process was grueling, designed by my own executives to test every facet of his character. He sailed through it. When he called me one night to share the incredible news that he'd been appointed as the new CEO of Sterling Logistics, the triumph in his voice was palpable. He thought he'd won the jackpot through sheer merit. I congratulated him with the practiced humility of a simple man, listening as he talked about how he was going to reshape the company, completely oblivious to the fact that he was walking into a house I had built board by board. Sophie was over the moon. The night I told her, we sat at my kitchen counter with mugs of chamomile tea, and she looked at me with that knowing glint in her eyes, the one that says she loves me but thinks I'm completely unhinged. "Dad," she said softly, "you do realize this is the plot of the soap opera, right?" I just smiled, looking out at the dark silhouette of the Blue Mountains. "I prefer to think of it as strategic family planning, Sophie." I was watching him closely now. I was the architect, and I was just waiting to see if he was a partner worth having or if he was the catalyst for the storm I'd been sensing all along. For 14 months, the experiment ran with a smoothness that almost unnerved me. Julian took to the corner office on the 19th floor of the Sydney CBD headquarters like he was born to it. He brought in lean management systems, optimized our supply chain routes across the Nullarbor, and boosted our quarterly margins by a percentage that made the board sit up and take notice. From my kitchen in the Blue Mountains, I watched the reports come in. Part of me, the proud father, felt a begrudging respect for his drive. He had a razor-sharp instinct for finding efficiencies where others saw only chaos. He wasn't just playing the role of CEO, he was genuinely excellent at it. But there was a lingering, cold annoyance that sat in the pit of my stomach, right alongside that respect. Every time Sophie visited, she'd talk about Julian's vision, about how he was finally going to modernize the family legacy, my legacy, into something global. It was a strange, disorienting sensation, listening to my own daughter praise the man who was currently fixing my company, oblivious to the fact that his every triumph was a reflection of the foundation I'd laid. I found myself in a bizarre, silent competition with him. If he successfully negotiated a tricky union contract, I'd find myself looking at my garden, wondering if I could have done it better, faster, with more grace. I'd sometimes drop by the office, unannounced, wearing my old work jacket and boots. I loved watching the reactions. The junior staff would look at me with mild confusion, but Julian, to his credit, always treated me with a polished, performative warmth. He'd put a hand on my shoulder, introduce me as Sophie's dad, the humble hobbyist, and then immediately pivot back to a conference call. He was playing a game of optics, creating a version of me that he felt comfortable with, someone small, someone quaint, someone harmless. The deeper he dug his heels in, the more the line between the company and his ego began to blur. I saw him start to take credit for initiatives that my long-term managers had proposed years ago, reframing them as his own innovation. It was the classic arrogance of a man who thought he had discovered fire, not realizing he was just burning the wood I had stacked. Sophie, meanwhile, was happier than I'd ever seen her. That was my primary leverage and also my greatest weakness. As long as Julian was performing, as long as he was the high-achieving CEO, she was safe, happy, and thriving. I kept my mouth shut, kept my observations to myself, and played the part of the doting, simple-minded father. I was waiting for him to trip. In my experience, people like Julian, those who think they are the smartest person in any room, inevitably leave a trail of crumbs. They get careless. They start to believe their own marketing. And I knew that when he finally made a mistake, it wouldn't be a small one. It would be something that stripped away the veneer of the corporate high-flyer and revealed the man underneath. I was patient. I had the view from the mountains, after all, and I knew how to wait for the fog to clear. One Thursday evening, the inevitable tremor arrived, not with a bang, but with a seemingly polite phone call. Julian called me, his voice adopting that specific, smooth resonance he reserved for business associates he wanted to disarm. "Artie," he said, the warmth in his tone feeling just a little too polished, "I'd love for you to join us for dinner this weekend. My parents are in town from the Gold Coast. They've been asking to meet the man behind Sophie's incredible spirit for quite some time." My gut tightened, a sharp, instinctive pull, like a wire snapping under tension. It wasn't an alarm, exactly, but a deep, resonant hum of recognition. They've been asking about me? I asked, my voice flat. Yeah, Julian replied, with a beat of silence that lingered a fraction of a second too long. You know how parents are. They just want to know who their son is marrying into. I almost declined. My intuition, seasoned by 3 decades of navigating the cutthroat currents of the logistics industry, was screaming that this wasn't a family dinner. It was a reconnaissance mission. But there's a part of me, the version that spent 30 years building something from nothing, the man who has stared down bankruptcy and betrayal and come out the other side, that refuses to run from an approaching storm. If they were looking for a fight, it was better to know the battlefield. Sure, I said, my voice steady. Tell me where. After I hung up, the silence of the mountains felt different. I stepped out onto the porch, the air crisp and biting against my face. I thought about the name Banks. I rolled it around in my mind, searching for a phantom. For years, I had kept the details of my early partnership with Victor Miller locked away in the quietest, darkest corners of my memory. Victor had been the brother I never had, and the Judas I never saw coming. When he orchestrated that hostile siphon of our joint accounts and proprietary contacts in the early 90s, he didn't just steal my money. He nearly destroyed my belief in human kindness. I stood there for a long time, watching the distant lights of Sydney flickering like cold, unreachable stars. A memory surfaced, sharp and painful. The day I finally sat Victor down in our tiny Columbus office and gave him the choice to disappear or face the law. He had chosen to run. I had rebuilt, alone, swearing never to trust a partner again. I had assumed the wreckage of that era was buried deep in the past, forgotten by time and distance. But as I leaned against the railing, a chilling thought settled in. A name like Miller doesn't just evaporate. It leaves scars, and sometimes those scars grow children who remember the stories their fathers told them, stories that were likely twisted, poisoned, and sold as truth. I felt a cold dread, not for myself, but for the life Sophie had built with this man. I knew then that the dinner wasn't just a request for a roast beef sundae. It was an interrogation, and I realized, with a grim sense of clarity, that the ghost of my past was finally coming home to collect a debt I didn't owe. The night of the dinner at Catalina in Rose Bay was uncharacteristically humid, the kind of heavy, salt-drenched air that clings to your skin. The restaurant was a fortress of glass and white linen, perched right over the harbor where the city lights danced like shattered diamonds on the dark water. I walked in wearing my cleanest flanny and a pair of moleskin trousers, not to be rebellious, but because I have nothing to prove to a menu that doesn't list prices. As I approached the table, Julian stood up, his suit razor sharp, looking like he'd been plucked from a glossy magazine. He didn't flinch at my attire. Instead, he flashed a smile that was almost pitying in its perfection. Stuart and Norma Banks were already seated. They looked like people who spent their entire lives curating an image of effortless superiority. Stuart rose with a double-handed shake that calculated aggressive warmth, that says, I'm going to win you over so thoroughly you won't even feel the knife when I slide it between your ribs. Norma touched my forearm with a manicured hand, her perfume a suffocatingly expensive cloud of sandalwood. Artie, darling, she cooed, her eyes not quite reaching the warmth of her voice. We've heard so much about your little garden in the mountains. It sounds so rustic. She said it like she was describing a petting zoo. We ordered. The conversation flowed with the forced, rhythmic precision of a well-rehearsed play. They probed ever so gently, asking about my early days, the structure of Sterling Logistics, and my relationship with Sophie. I played the part of the slow-witted, slightly overwhelmed old man, nodding at the right times, letting them believe they had successfully pigeonholed me as a harmless relic. But every nerve in my body was hummed with a primal, predatory focus. I watched how Julian held his wine glass, the way he glanced at his father for cues, the subtle tilt of his head when the topic turned to the company's valuation. Beneath the veneer of high society charm, I felt a deep, profound sadness. I looked at Sophie laughing at a joke Julian told, and I felt a pang of protectiveness that bordered on physical pain. She was sitting in the middle of a trap, oblivious to the fact that the people smiling at her were the architects of a long-standing grudge. There was a raw, aching contrast between the sparkling harbor view and the cold, hollow hearts of the people sitting across from me. I realized then that they weren't just here to negotiate. They were here to gloat. They truly believed that they had already won, that I was a broken man ripe for the taking. I picked up my water glass, my hand perfectly steady, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I wasn't just a guest at their table anymore. I was the silent observer of their downfall, watching them tighten the noose around their own necks, one polite, empty word at a time. The game had begun, and they hadn't realized that the person they were trying to bury was the one who owned the graveyard. The main course had barely been cleared when the rhythm of the evening shifted. Stuart Banks wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, the movement precise, almost clinical. He didn't signal the waiter or check his phone. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his bespoke blazer. He pulled out an envelope, cream-colored, heavy stock, the kind of paper that screams legal proceedings before you even break the seal. He placed it on the table between us with a deliberate, soft thud, a sound that seemed to silence the surrounding chatter of the dining room. He didn't push it toward me. He simply left it there, an anchor of dread in the middle of our dinner. Norma picked up her wine glass, her movements suddenly stiff, her eyes darting towards Sophie as if checking to ensure she was still blissfully out of the loop. Julian, meanwhile, did the one thing that confirmed my worst fears. He looked down at his plate. He studied the remnants of his meal with a sudden, intense fascination, refusing to meet my gaze. That was the moment the mask slipped. The silence at the table thickened, suffocating and heavy. It wasn't the silence of polite conversation. It was the suffocating quiet of an ambush. "Artie," Stuart began, his voice dropping into that somber, faux sincere register that men use when they are about to ruin a life while pretending to do you a favor. "We've been wanting to sit down with you for a long time. There are some things about the past, about your history, your business origins, that we think deserve an honest conversation." His tone was infuriatingly condescending, laced with the smug certainty of a man who believes he is holding a royal flush. I looked at the envelope, then at Stuart's expectant, hungry eyes, and finally at Julian's bowed head. A cold, crystalline calm settled over me. For 22 years, I had built an empire, kept my head down, and honored the silence I'd sworn to myself. And now, here it was, the bill coming due for a debt I never owed, presented by the kin of the man who had tried to bury me 3 decades ago. The indignation I felt was sharp like a physical blade, but I pushed it down, burying it under layers of steel-willed composure. I felt a fleeting, heartbreaking ache for the version of this story Stuart had been fed, a narrative of victimhood, bitterness, and lies that he had likely carried like a torch his entire adult life. "Stuart," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried with the weight of granite. I didn't reach for the envelope. I picked up my water glass, the crystal cool against my skin, and took a slow, agonizingly steady sip. Every eye at the table was glued to me. I could feel the electricity in the air, the desperate, frantic energy of people who were terrified that their trap might not snap shut. I looked at the envelope again, and for the first time I smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had already spent the last week dismantling every single argument they were about to throw at me. I wasn't trapped at this table. They were. They just didn't know it yet. I didn't reach for the envelope. Instead, I picked up my fork and cut a piece of my steak, perfectly seared pink in the middle. I chewed slowly, deliberately, forcing them to wait. In business, as in life, silence is the most expensive currency you can spend. If you use it correctly, it makes the other person pay for everything. I let the silence hang over that table like a heavy, uninvited guest. Norma shifted in her seat, the rustle of her silk blouse loud in the sudden quiet. Stuart's patient, rehearsed smile began to develop a hairline fracture at the corner of his mouth. He was used to people reacting, apologizing, or getting angry. He wasn't used to being ignored. Across from me, Julian still hadn't looked up. He was staring at his plate with such intensity that I almost felt a flicker of pity for him. He was a bright man, a capable CEO, but in this moment, he was nothing more than a pawn in his father's clumsy chess game. After what I counted as a very satisfying 45 seconds of absolute stillness, I set my fork down, wiped my mouth with a cloth napkin, and finally allowed my fingers to graze the cream-colored envelope. I didn't open it. I simply let my hand rest on it, feeling the texture of the expensive paper. "Stuart," I said, my voice quiet but steady, cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant. "Before I read whatever version of history you've printed in here, I think you need to understand something about the man sitting across from you." Stuart leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with that dangerous, triumphant light. He thought he was finally getting a reaction. "I'm listening, Artie," he said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial purr. I leaned into the center of the table, lowering my voice until they had a strain to hear me. In my 30 years in this industry, I've learned one fundamental rule. I never sit down at a table I haven't already flipped. The envelope sat between us like an unexploded grenade, the pin already pulled. I could see the confusion flickering behind Stuart's eyes, the sudden, creeping realization that the choreography of the evening had gone horribly wrong. I felt a surge of cold, sharp clarity. The grief for the boy Victor had been, the friend I had loved, and the partner who had tried to erase me, surged up and was then forcefully tamped down. This wasn't about Victor anymore. It was about the audacity of these people, trying to use my daughter's love as a lever to pry open my life. I looked at Stuart, then at Julian, and finally at Sophie, who was watching me with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I simply held their gaze, one by one, until they each looked away. I was the architect, and tonight, I was finally ready to show them the blueprints of their own undoing. I finally broke the seal. Inside were photocopied documents, organized with that obsessive, legalistic neatness that screams professional extortion. As my eyes traced the name at the top of the first page, Victor Miller, a strange, chilling stillness descended upon my chest. For a moment, the bustling sounds of Catalina faded into a distant, muffled hum. I was 26 again, back in that cramped, humid office in Columbus, filled with the smell of cheap coffee and the suffocating weight of betrayal. Victor hadn't just been my partner. He had been my brother in ambition. We had built our future on trust, or so I had believed, until the day I found the double books, the shell companies, and a systematic theft that had hollowed out our dream like termites in a support beam. "Where did you get these?" I asked, my voice barely a tremor in the quiet. Stuart didn't blink. He watched me with the predatory focus of a man who believes he is delivering a death blow. "Victor kept records, Artie. His own records. Everything you did to him, every ultimatum, every threat, the way you forced him out of a company he helped build. The audacity of it was almost breathtaking." I looked up at Stuart, and for a fleeting second, I saw his true face. Not the wealthy socialite, but a grieving brother clinging to a poisoned narrative for 30 years. He genuinely believed his brother was a martyr. I felt a surge of genuine, albeit cold, sorrow. "Stuart," I said, my voice softening, "I'm sorry you lost your brother. I truly am. I don't want her pity," he spat, the veneer of civility finally peeling away. "I want you to resign from Sterling Logistics quietly. I want a formal financial settlement. The number is in the envelope, to be paid as restitution for what you stole from my family. Do this, and your son-in-law's career remains untarnished." That was when Julian finally looked up. The sight of him was devastating. He wasn't the confident CEO anymore. He was a man witnessing his own worldview crumble. He looked from his father's fanatical, narrowed eyes to my face, searching for a lie, a weakness, or an escape. He looked terrified. "I'm not going to argue the morality of the past with you," I said, my voice hardening like tempered steel as I reached into my own blazer. I pulled out a small, unassuming white envelope, the kind that carries no weight but holds the power to burn a life to the ground. "But before you spend that money in your head, Stuart, I think you should see what Victor was too careful to include in his scrapbook. I placed my envelope on the table. It was thin, light, and unremarkable. Stuart's eyes dropped to it, and the triumphant smirk he'd worn all evening faltered. He didn't know it yet, but the trap had just snapped shut. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to point fingers. In the quietest voice possible, I began to dismantle the lie that had defined Stuart's life, watching. The color drained from his face as the truth began to bleed out of the paper. I didn't rush the reveal. I let the silence hang, heavy and suffocating, before I began to speak. I walked them through the bank records from 1989 to 1991, detailing the precise, calculated wire transfers Victor had funneled into shell companies registered in his wife's maiden name. I read out the damning emails, correspondence where Victor explicitly outlined his plan to steal our client lists and cannibalize the business I had bled to build. I produced the sworn affidavit from Dale Pruitt, our former accountant, who was still alive, sharp-witted, and more than willing to testify. As I spoke, I watched the architecture of Stuart's lifelong grudge collapse in real time. He wasn't a righteous avenger. He was a man who had built his identity on a foundation of carefully curated fairy tales. He didn't die a victim, Stuart, I said, my voice quiet, stripped of any malice, which only made it sharper. He died a man who couldn't handle the consequences of his own greed. He lied to you because he couldn't bear to see himself as the villain in his own story. In all these years, you've been carrying his shame, thinking it was your burden to bear. Stuart looked like a man who had just been dropped from a great height. His hands were shaking, and his carefully groomed composure had completely evaporated. Then, I turned my attention to Julian. I looked him dead in the eye. The CEO, the high flyer, the man who thought he had outrun his own shadow. Clayton, sorry, Julian, I said, a slight, cold smile touching my lips. Did you ever wonder why the board accepted you so quickly? Why the firm that headhunted you was so eager to place you in a corner office on the 19th floor? The frown that creased Julian's brow was deep, but then it simply vanished. His face went blank. It was a total system shutdown. The look of a man who had just realized his entire reality was a stage play, and he was nothing more than an extra. I'm Arthur Sterling, I said, my voice steady as the tide. Founder and sole owner of Sterling Logistics. The logistics isn't just a name. It's the empire I built after. Victor left. You haven't been running a firm, Julian. You've been running my company. You've been signing my contracts, sitting in my chair, and drawing a salary that I personally approved, all to ensure Sophie would never have to worry about a man who didn't possess the character to look me in the eye. The room felt impossibly quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioning. Julian's mouth opened, then snapped shut. He looked at his father, then at me, and for the first time, he didn't look like a CEO or a socialite. He looked small. He looked like a man who had suddenly lost the floor beneath his feet. I felt no joy in his humiliation, only a profound, hollow sense of finality. This was the cost of pretense. This was what happens when you build your life on someone else's lies. I didn't need to do anything else. The truth, in all its brutal, unadorned simplicity, had done the work for me. The fallout was not the chaotic spectacle one sees in movies. It was far more devastating in its silence. Stuart Banks, a man who had walked in with the swagger of a conqueror, now looked like a ghost haunting his own life. He picked up his napkin, a pathetic, tremulous gesture, and stood up. He didn't reach for the envelope anymore. He didn't have the stomach for it. As he shuffled past Julian, he paused, a flicker of desperate, fatherly entitlement crossing his face, but he didn't speak. He simply walked out into the humid Sydney night, his wife trailing behind him like a shadow, leaving the weight of 30 years of lies on the tablecloth. Julian and I remained. The waiter, bless his oblivious soul, approached with a tentative smile, offering dessert. I ordered 2 slices of homemade cake and real coffee. When he left, I looked at Julian. He was visibly vibrating with the effort of holding himself together, his worldview shredded. "Why?" he whispered, his voice stripped of all corporate polish. "Why put me in that seat, Artie?" I took a sip of the coffee, looking out at the dark, restless harbor. Because I needed to know if you were the man I hoped you were or the man your father raised you to be, I said softly. You've done an incredible job for my company, Julian. You saved us millions on the Western region. You restructured the fleet with a vision I honestly lacked. You have real talent. But talent without character is just a dangerous weapon. He looked down, his eyes wet with a shame I hadn't seen in him before, raw, honest human shame. I'm not like him, he said, his voice cracking. I didn't know the extent of the grudge. I didn't want this to be about that. I know, I replied. And that's why you still have a job on Monday. He looked up, stunned. I didn't offer a hug or a lecture. I slid the check for the dessert toward him. It wasn't an olive branch, but it wasn't a sword either. It was a clean slate. We ate the cake in a silence that felt, for the first time, not like an ambush, but like a beginning. I drove home alone in the 2005 Land Cruiser. The city lights of Sydney faded into the rear view, replaced by the dense, comforting darkness of the Blue Mountains. When I pulled into my driveway, my house was glowing with a warm, amber light. Sophie had stopped by, and she'd forgotten to turn off the porch lamp again. I sat in the truck for a long moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, feeling the deep, settled peace of a storm that had finally passed. My phone buzzed. A text from Julian. I told Sophie everything. She's furious at the deception, but she said she's proud of the man I'm choosing to be. I smiled in the dark, leaned my head against the steering wheel, and let out a breath I felt I'd been holding for 3 decades. I didn't need an empire to feel whole. I had my tomatoes to water in the morning, a daughter who was safe, and the quiet, heavy mountains that knew exactly who I was. Some men build legacies to prove their worth. I built mine to protect what truly mattered. And tonight, for the first time, I knew I had succeeded.